Good day from London and welcome to the Climate Security in the Current and Future Global Conflict Landscape session, part of the digital segment of the BCSC 2022. I'm the chair of the session. My name is Irene Mia. I'm Senior Fellow for Conflict Security and Development in Latin America at the International Institute of Strategic Studies. For those of you who don't know the Institute, we are a world-leading authority on global security, political risk, and conflict. We are based in London, but we have offices across the world, including Berlin. The session of today will provide an opportunity to preview and discuss some of the findings of our upcoming Armed Conflict Survey 2022, ahead of its launch on November 18. Before we start, I just want to thank our friends at the Adelphi for the opportunity to be part of the digital segment of their Berlin Climate Security Conference 2022. I was fortunate enough to attend the conference last week, the in-person program, which was incredibly insightful with respect to understanding the complex nexus between climate change and conflict, and also groundbreaking in stating the need to have climate security, hard and soft, at the center of government's agenda, as well as guiding principle of foreign policy. The Armed Conflict Survey series is one of the annual flagship publication of the IISS, which has been monitoring and making sense of the global conflict landscape since the inception of the series in 2015. And we actually have, we're showing the copy of the new report, which will be, as I said, launched on November 18 in Manama at our event there. The report, as I say, aims to provide our audience of expert, practitioner, and policymakers with a strategic assessment of domestic, regional, and global conflict drivers, as well as of current developments and future trends, including conflict drivers, political risk, and potential hotspots for conflict. Our filter to understand conflict and to explain conflict is double at the Institute. We look, of course, at the domestic dynamics and root causes of conflict, including the ever-proliferating non-state armed groups, which represent the important features of today's conflict. But also, in line with the IISS Global and Strategic Research Focus, we adopt a more geopolitical lens at the study of conflicts. So we try to map the geopolitical drivers, but also interlinkages and repercussions. So we always have this kind of double filter for conflict. The 2022 edition of the report, besides analyzing 33 active conflicts globally across the world and covering key regional trends, includes special features of climate security. And this is given increased urgency to understand the complex interlinkages between climate change, climate vulnerability, and conflict amid accelerating global warming, but also the increasing crucial role climate change plays in global stability and security. The report delves into three important aspects of the climate conflict nexus, selected for their strategic importance in shaping the conflict landscape of today, but also of the future, at the international as well as geopolitical level. At the local domestic level, climate change complicates conflict dynamics by exacerbating their drivers and amplifying or creating tension and grievances, for instance, around scarce natural resources, ever scarcer natural resources amid accelerating climate change. But also climate change is playing an increasingly important role in geopolitics, as we all know. Interstate tension around global energy transition and control of critical minerals, as well as mitigation strategies, are on the rise, and climate change is definitely becoming another kernel of geopolitical competition. To discuss all these dimensions and more, and also hopefully discuss about some possible solution and way forward, I'm joined today by two friends and climate experts, which are author two of the chapters, including the Armed Conflict Surveys, as well as a colleague from the IISS, which I'll introduce in order of appearance on my screen. Starting with Laura Bergman, who is Senior Strategic Analyst and Head of the Climate and Security Program at the Hague Center for Strategic Studies. Laura leads a range of projects focusing on the security implication of climate change and represents the Institute in Water, Peace and Security, which is a project that looks to pioneer the development of innovative tools and services that help identify and address water-related security risk. Laura is also a member of the International Military Council on Climate and Security. Previously, Laura worked as principal and senior consultant at EcoRIS, an international research consulting firm, and she also worked for the Dutch government, focusing on food security, biodiversity, and trade policy. Welcome, Laura. We're also joined by Alec Crawford, who is the Director of Nature for Resilience at the International Institute for Sustainable Development. His work focuses on mining governance, climate change adaptation, and the links among environmental change, natural resources, conflict, and peace building. Within the resilience team, Alec leads work on environment and conflict and peace building. He has also worked extensively on climate change adaptation, and previously working with the economic law and policy program of the Institute. Alec worked with the Intergovernmental Forum on Mining, Minerals, Metals, and Sustainable Development to better understand how countries can optimize the contribution that the mining sector can make to sustainable development, which is a key issue. Thanks for joining us, Alec. Finally, we're also joined by my colleague Erika Pepe, who is Senior Coordinator for Research in the IISS Director General Office. She's also a research analyst with us at the Conflict Security and Development Program. Erika co-authored with me one of the papers on climate security, including the report. So I'm looking forward to discuss that with her as well. Before we start, some quick housekeeping rules. We will start with a round of introductory remarks from the three speakers, followed by discussion, which we would like to be as interactive and inclusive as possible. To that end, it would be fantastic if you could add your questions, comment on the Q&A box, which you see at the bottom of your screen, and we will pick them up in the course of the conversation, but also we'll have a dedicated Q&A section at the end of the panel. Laura, if I can start with you and the geopolitical dimension of climate change, could you give us a brief overview of how climate change is actually acting as a driver of geopolitical tension, and what is the outlook for that, which was actually the topic of your great contribution this year?
Yes, I would be happy to do so. Hello, everybody, and thank you to IISS for the opportunity to contribute to the Armed Conflict Survey for this year, and also to Adelphi for being our gracious host here at the Berlin Climate Security Conference. So the chapter that I focused on is called Transition in Turbulence, Geostrategic Implications of Climate Change and the Energy Transition. And as the title suggests, it focuses on the geopolitical and geo-economic dimensions of climate change and the related global energy transition. And of course, what this means in terms of interstate relations. And to get a sense of how these developments may unfold, I zoom in on three main points. Firstly, the impact of interstate tensions and geopolitical stressors on climate change mitigation responses. Secondly, the level of state alignment to address global warming and their incentives to support the energy transition. And thirdly, the increasing geostrategic competition over renewable resources essential for this energy transition to succeed. So let me start with the first point. The impact of these interstate tensions and geopolitical stressors on broader efforts to reduce global warming. The willingness and ability to respond to climate change and address global warming will differ and differs actually between states and depends on a lot of factors. And this includes emission levels, their development stages, strategic priorities, resource dependencies, technological progress, and of course, critically, the ability to adapt to and absorb the resulting social, political, and economic shocks. And as the climate threat is a global challenge, it also depends on ongoing and emerging geopolitical realities, relative geo-economic leverage, and some sort of agreement that must evolve between developing and developed countries in terms of how to finance this trajectory. So a key question that dominates the discussion now and in the future is who bears more responsibility to act and to pay? And while it is broadly accepted that top greenhouse gas emitting countries should play a bigger role in reducing global warming than those that play a smaller role, it is actually far from clear if and how they will collaborate on this in the future. And who are these top emitters exactly? and what is their interest and leverage to collectively address climate change. So according to the US National Intelligence Estimate on Climate Change, the top 10 emitters of greenhouse gases are responsible for 70% of global emissions. Of this top 10, it is China, the US, the EU, India, and Russia that round up the top 5, respectively. And not only do they underscore that population, geography, and economy are major international emission drivers, by virtue of their size, these countries and regions actually play a role in shaping the geopolitical trends and developments that are at play in the future. And so to this end, these top emitters actually provide a very useful lens to assess the potential for effective or less effective international action on climate change. So China and the US are the 2 largest economies and highest emitters in the world, both accounting for almost 40% of these global emissions. Both invest heavily in green energy technologies and will likely set important standards for the rest of the world. And so despite these common interests, serious collaboration between China and the US on climate change is unlikely in the near term. We have all seen the bilateral tensions that have emerged over the years on geopolitics, human rights, trade, and security. And this is actually leaving potential joint efforts on climate change fraught with uncertainty. A good example of this is the recent US-China climate accord that came out of COP26, which was immediately undone by the Chinese following Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan in early August. So this is not a good starting point for raising ambition on climate mitigation during COP27 this November in Egypt. So with interstate tensions between already these top 2 emitters at an all-time high, the commitment of other top emitters, the EU, India, and Russia, but also more broadly, the G20, will be of key importance if we are to reach global emission targets. Also here, we cannot boast a hopeful picture. Weeks before the invasion of the Ukraine in February, Russia concluded a series of oil and gas agreements with China, including a 30-year deal to supply China with 10 billion cubic meters of gas per year via a new pipeline. Moscow also developed new economic partnerships in the global south, following US and EU announcements to discontinue energy collaborations with Russia. The latter, so Russia signed long-term oil and gas delivery agreements with India at record low prices. And so this brings me to the second key point raised in the chapter. Are states really aligned to support climate change mitigation efforts? And what are their incentives to support or delay the energy transition? So the actions required to remain within critical global warming thresholds necessitate a transition from the old fossil fuel-based energy system to a new low carbon one. And whilst even the most advanced economies will struggle to transition to greener energy sources, it will be very difficult for countries like China and India to satisfy their energy demands with low carbon alternatives. And sudden geopolitical shocks can be important catalysts for change. So the Russia-Ukraine war and partial boycotts of Russian fossil fuels have led to a surge in international oil and gas prices. And this will likely lead to fundamental shifts towards cleaner energy consumption in the longer term, especially in Europe and the United States. However, it will also force oil and gas producers to find alternative markets at lower prices. So in the next decade, the Western transition actually to a low carbon economy may paradoxically result in increased consumption of fossil fuels in developing countries as oil and gas become cheaper alternatives to renewable energy resources. And the required R&D investments for developing renewables still come with very high technological and infrastructure costs. So in the short term, the Global South could benefit from the lower market prices resulting from reduced demand in the EU and the US. And this may strengthen their energy security and aid job creation and economic growth. But in the medium term, as renewables become more competitive in the world market, new trade patterns may emerge and presenting new sources of geopolitical clout for those well-positioned in green energy markets. But again, this will not happen overnight. So depending on their ability to adapt to these dynamics, state actors will likely split into 3 camps. those that embrace the global clean energy transition, those that will continue oil and gas production and consumption, and those that will explore both options until it becomes more opportune to forgo one for the other. So China will be the key player to watch, because as the world's largest carbon emitter and biggest investor in green renewables, it currently sets the global pace for phasing down fossil fuel production and increasing renewable energy use. A decisive shift in the global south to clean energy would challenge the development model and economic sustainability of oil and gas exporting countries. And as the physical impacts of climate change are projected to hit poor countries the hardest, there will be a strong incentive for them to transition to renewables. However, given their equally pressing development challenges, the pull of those cheaper fossil fuel resources may still be irresistible without the financial and technological support of the energy transition leaders. So to conclude with a third complicating factor, I want to say a few words about aligning climate change mitigation goals and what this means in terms of increased geo-strategic competition that is emerging over renewable resources. The urgent need to decarbonize will likely result actually in increased competition to control and dominate the resources and technologies needed for the green energy transition. The resources in question include critical minerals, such as copper and zinc, which are essential for wind and solar infrastructure, lithium and nickel, essential for electric vehicles, and cobalt. As with fossil fuels, the production and supply of these critical minerals is not equally distributed. So if current conditions continue, the undisputed leader in the global renewable economy will be China. As I mentioned earlier, the country currently dominates the energy renewable market, and specifically the global production of critical minerals. It plays a huge role in their value chain process and is a key market for them. In fact, 72% and 61% of the world's cobalt and lithium respectively are processed in China. At the same time, other countries will be in a position to strengthen their geostrategic position in the global renewables market. The top producer of copper are currently Chile, Peru, as well as China, while the top producers of lithium are Australia, Chile, in addition to China. So the US and Germany are currently the second and third largest investors in clean energy and R&D, and may join forces to reduce China's dominance in the future. China will therefore have to contend with increased competition at all levels in the markets driving the green energy transition. With the US and EU investments in renewables on the rise, it is likely these countries will benefit from the tensions between the former on the one hand and China on the others. So perhaps to conclude my introduction, what do these developments mean for our collective ability to reduce global warming? Despite the bleak picture in the near term and the real risk we will not achieve the 2030 target to keep within 1.5 degrees, current geopolitical developments may ultimately support climate change mitigation. Russia's invasion of Ukraine and China's dominance and assertiveness in international renewable markets have pushed the US, EU, and others to reduce their oil and natural gas dependencies, accelerate the green energy technologies, and rethink supply security. So for the immediate term, we are likely to see a regression into using dirty fossil fuels, even coal, to compensate for the shortfall in natural gas that was offered by Russia. But in the medium to longer term, these spikes may be offset by the accelerated investments in renewables and other less dirty alternatives. In other words, the phase out period may take longer, but efforts to take and phase in cleaner energy alternatives will likely be intensified. To manage this process, it will be critical to monitor the top greenhouse gas emitters and see how they assert themselves, where they put their investments, with whom they will align, and what incentives they bring to the table, both nationally and internationally, to either support or stall the global energy transition. And as I mentioned, in the next decade, it will be critical to watch China. Whilst in the short term, its interest will be served by fossil fuel extraction, as the lead investor, producer, and supplier of renewables, China has everything to gain from a faster transition to clean energy. The question then becomes not if the global energy transition will materialize, but who will control the standards that set the rules of the game. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. That was a fascinating panorama of all the challenges and opportunity climate mitigation, in really achieving an energy transition, and also this interesting kind of division of the world, if you will, in maybe again global south, global north, or an aligned movement of countries, which we probably have also different type, a different sync energy transition for the reason you mentioned. And I'm looking forward to discuss actually more in details about what the incentive could be once we finish the round of introductory remarks. To that extent, I just wanted to remind our audience that they can already put their question in the Q&A box if they have any, just to avoid losing the thread, since we're going to be covering quite a lot of different topics in our three contribution. So moving from critical minerals for the energy transition to more general scarce natural resources amid accelerating climate change and their increasing importance, given that they're becoming scarcer and scarcer. What we have seen in looking at monitoring conflict across the years and across the regions of the world, is really the use of natural resources as a weapon of war, also as a weapon of increased legitimacy or of political leverage by a variety of actors in internal conflict, especially non-state armed groups. Of course, it is something that doesn't happen only and solely at the internal level, the internal conflict level. Of course, we've seen, and Laura has alluded to, interstate dispute of tension, which would be around natural resources. But with Erica, we have decided to focus our analysis this year on what's happening in internal conflict, and especially what is the role of non-state armed group in really using and protecting or as it happens more often in really kind of using natural resources as weapon of war. So Erica, can you give us a bit of a general overview on the main challenges related to natural resources and non-state armed group, as well as possible solution? Maybe we can discuss about the possible solution more in the second part of the section, but please give us a brief overview of where we stand on this issue.
Thank you very much, Irene, for the introduction. And let me also thank the organizers of the Berlin Climate Security Conference for the kind of invitation to speak in this very interesting panel today. So to come back to what you were saying, as you mentioned, in the Armed Conflict Survey 2022, we've been exploring climate security issues, and in particular, we've been looking at the forms and the changing dynamics of the instrumentalizations of natural resources in the context of climate change. And in particular, we've been looking at the role of non-state armed groups and international responses to this issue. Well, the reason why we've been focusing on this is that we believe it is increasingly crucial to better understand the nexus between climate change and natural resources and their weaponization in what we call the continuum of war, and also in consideration of the proliferation of many different conflict actors. And additionally, it is very important also to understand the challenges facing the policymakers and the international community to what this form of instrumentalization, so how this form of instrumentalization can be prevented and addressed when this involves non-state armed groups. And I think an infographic that we produced can help discussing this. So I would be grateful if you could please put this slide up so we can, thank you very much. So this is a slide that we produced and then is included in our chapter in the book, and it helps discussing this issue. So starting from the left, there is consensus on the fact that the physical effects of climate change is increasing the pressure on the availability, quality, and accessibility of scarce natural resources, such as water and fertile land, to give an example. And now, so what we argue is that this provides an opportunity for conflict parties to use this as a tool for military and political leverage in armed conflicts, but also before and in the aftermath of armed conflicts. And of course, we can argue that disputes over scarce natural resources have driven competition and conflicts for decades. And just over the last 60 years, 40% of all intrastate conflicts had a link to natural resources. And also, as Lara discussed in her chapter in the book, the changing climate is set to increase the potential for conflicts in the future. But when it comes to internal conflicts, it is particularly alarming that an ever-growing number of non-state armed groups have been leveraging the climate effects on natural resources as an instrument of warfare, or to strengthen their control on the territories or their legitimacy with the general population. And I think it is worth mentioning a couple of interesting data about this. So in the world, from 60 million to 80 million people live under the quasi-state governance of non-state armed groups, and 70% of the countries which are affected by internal conflicts that we analyze in the armed conflict survey score high or extremely high in the resource scarcity domain. And this means that they are particularly exposed to a combination of water risk, food risk, population growth. And this is also not considering that the situation in terms of food security is getting worse because of the war in Ukraine. So despite the importance of this issue, the limitations of the existing international regulatory framework then does not seem to be preventing conflict parties from weaponize natural resources. But I will come back to this later. So now, please have a look at the middle of the infographic. The issue seems quite straightforward. As resources grow scarcer, those who control them gain power. But a phenomenon is way more complex than this. And so for this reason, we created a framework to try and understand this in more detail. And so we try to unpack the many different forms of instrumentalization to help trying identify the shortcomings and opportunities for action when this involves non-state armed groups, and also to go beyond the active phase of conflicts and to look at the conflict continuum, so before and after an armed conflict takes place. So we looked at the main motivation behind resource instrumentalization, whether this is to prevail over the enemy or whether this is to reinforce political leverage and legitimacy, for example, in the post-conflict phase. So looking at the slide, what we describe as military weaponization are the cases when natural resources are exploited as target or weapon during an active conflict to either secure strategic goals or for tactical purposes. And this typology includes when resource control is used to, for example, intimidate and coerce opposing parties or civilian population. And just to give an example, it could be seizing control of dams. But also this includes psychological warfare, for example, threatening to attack a key water infrastructure. And these dynamics in the context of internal conflicts often involve different actors, and more than not, this practice has been an integral part of non-state armed groups, military strategies and campaigns. And of course, this has important strategic and security implications, because this has provided non-state armed groups with the ability to inflict targeted damage without necessarily attacking, occupying, or controlling areas militarily, and so this has enabled them to gain greater military capacity they would have in conventional warfare. So, and an example of this are the cases of Syria and Iraq, for example, where water scarcity has been instrumentalized under Bashar al-Assad and Saddam Hussein, but it is with ISIS that the strategic deployment of water has become systematic and consistent, and has become part of the group's military strategy on a scale that was unprecedented in modern warfare. And just to give an example, studies show that this Islamic State has been responsible for about half of the water weaponization incidents during the period 2012-2015. But of course, ISIS military weaponization of water in Syria is not a unique case, and we have several examples in the book in many other regions. So now going back to the infographic, the second cluster of instrumentalization of natural resources, as we identified, is the political weaponization that refers to when natural resources are instrumentalized for political leverage or to reinforce legitimacy, as we said. And this is not limited to the active conflict phase, but can be observed along the continuum in the instability phases that could precede conflicts or in the aftermath of conflicts. And we could argue that the political leverage could be considered a negative instrument, but we could also include what we call kind of positive elements. For example, in terms of protection of specific natural resources to incentivize support of cooperation from local population. And this is the case of non-state armed groups, for example, positioning themselves as alternative providers for water and land. And we've seen many cases of this from Nigeria to Colombia, and we cover this in the book as well. But of course, reinforcing legitimacy, it is not necessarily positive in terms of protection, but rather it could be also used for exploitation, as it's been shown by cases like Al-Shabaab in Somalia, where the control of water and food supplies has been wielded, and they've been imposing taxes on the use of water resources and agricultural products. I think we can now remove the slide just to conclude on this. I wanted to put the attention to the fact that in all these cases that we discussed, the main challenges in addressing this issue, it is the fact that the applicability, compliance, and enforcement of international rule is an issue. And of course, there are international humanitarian law, international environmental law, and international human rights law principles that do provide a framework in terms of regulatory framework for the prevention and instrumentalization of natural resources. But the enforcement and applicability to non-state actors is challenging. And there are, of course, several rules in place. But for example, just to give an example, the rules that are in place for preventing environmental damage during warfare. But even in that case, there are challenges in terms of implementation. For example, how to assess whether a given natural resource is a legitimate military target, how to judge proportionality, and in particular, when it comes to non-state armed groups, the problem of the effectiveness of these mechanisms is aggravated by the fact that they are not bound to international law in the same way as state actors are, despite they represent the majority of perpetrators in present conflict landscape. Said that, however, in recent years, there have been encouraging developments, both in terms of regulations and engagement with non-state actors. There are in fact rules specifically applying to non-state actors in the UN environmental modification, for example, in the Statute of the International Criminal Court, in the Geneva Conventions, Protocols 1. But despite these developments, we believe that we should put more efforts in further engage with non-state armed groups, just to improve the compliance, but also the accountability, but also to raise awareness of the consequences of using increasingly fragile natural resources as integral part of their welfare and strategies for power. But maybe we can come back to this in the discussion.
Thanks, Erika, and really was quite a challenging topic to cover because there are so many different dimensions of it, right? And I think it's important once again, what you are mentioning, that 60 to 80 million people are actually living under the governance of semi-governance of non-state armed groups, just to once again highlight the importance to engage and to really make sure that those actors are subject to some form to the other kind of international rules that apply to other more kind of legal in international law terms, war or conflict parties. We'll have the opportunity to discuss about solution there, because we have seen in our analysis that there have been not just some evolution in terms of international rules, international regulatory environment, but also in terms of actual action taken in that respect. But just to finish our round of introductory remarks, and possibly on a more positive note, Alec, we know that climate and conflict are closely related, which is something that should be taken into account also when it comes to the aftermath of war, right, and stabilization and peace building. Could you talk us through the interrelation between climate change and stabilization, peace building, and climate resilience, as well as the opportunity for aligning the peace building and climate resilience agendas in fragile and conflict-ridden countries, please?
Of course. Thank you very much, Irina, for the introduction, and thanks again to our hosts for inviting me to participate in this. The chapter that I contributed to the volume was on the aftermath of war in a changing climate and how you can align climate security and peace building. And for my comments today, I will try to offer a slightly more optimistic note for us to end on. This topic can often be quite bleak and depressing, but I'll try my best to offer some positive potential paths forward. One of the things that I wanted to focus on was work that I've been doing at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, IISD, on the national adaptation planning process. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the NAP process, it's an effort by developing countries to align their medium and long-term adaptation priorities with their medium and long-term development priorities. So really putting adaptation to climate change at the heart of how they are planning to develop over time. The NAP process is underway in most countries. It's a process that's been initiated. It's got a lot of international support at the moment, and a lot of efforts are going into this. And I think it offers a kind of very unique and very promising opportunity to, again, try to align some of these adaptation objectives and priorities with peace-building agendas. For fragile states in particular, conflict-affected contexts, it can be extremely difficult to prioritize climate adaptation. I don't want to pretend that that's not the case. Governments have to reestablish security, they have to rebuild schools, hospitals, transportation infrastructure, create jobs and support livelihoods, you name it. There's a lot of priorities within that context, and many of them are urgent. There is, however, I think, it would be a mistake to neglect these medium and long-term adaptation needs as you're thinking through some of those, policies and plans as you emerge from conflict. Because doing so would undermine the long-term sustainability of those initiatives. Of course, I think most of the people here would probably agree that conflict and climate risks often share many of the same drivers. Multidimensional poverty, histories of violence, inequality. Many of the drivers are similar, and many of these can be mutually reinforcing. So there can be, a vicious cycle that's created by conflict, undermining adaptive capacity, and of course, climate change contributing to conflict and violence. So crucial that these underlying risks and vulnerabilities are addressed. And of course, adaptation and adaptation planning can help do that. If you look at the Fragile States Index and any kind of measure of vulnerability to climate change and countries that are least ready to adapt to climate change, you'll see that there's a lot of overlap in those two lists. So for many fragile states, climate vulnerabilities are among the highest in the world. This is a combination of many things: their high sensitivity to climate risk, the geography of kind of where they are, their economic reliance on climate-dependent sectors like agriculture, and again, histories of things like weak governance, conflict, and poverty, each of which can undermine climate resilience. Countries that are on kind of both those lists aren't going to surprise anyone, I don't think. Yemen, Somalia, Central African Republic, DRC, Sudan, Afghanistan, Chad. There's a number of countries that, again, are being hit by these twin crises of trying to emerge from conflict, but also trying to adapt to climate change. Why does it make sense within these kinds of contexts to try to align a peace-building agenda with an adaptation agenda or an adaptation process, planning process? Well, there's kind of a few reasons why I think this is particularly promising. The NAP process itself is designed to focus, again, on medium and long-term timelines. We're not talking about immediate adaptation needs. These are more integrating it into the country's longer-term development priorities. As many of you, again, will know, if you're emerging from conflict, you're looking at a peace-building process that is, I think, on average, 20 to 25 years to fully recover from violence. So again, these are medium and long-term timelines that most countries are faced with. So alignment on timelines is one reason. Again, the NAP process is designed, as is most peace-building processes, to take a holistic approach to addressing risk and vulnerability. And again, many of these risks and vulnerabilities are shared. The NAP process is also very participative. It's country-owned, it's country-driven. These are not adaptation plans that are imposed upon conflict-affected states, but rather plans that are developed by them in response to their own context and their own needs. Again, much as peace-building plans are. And they're, of course, undermined by strengthened governance systems. That's at the key of the NAP process, is how do you build up the institutions and the governance systems that can deliver upon these promises. Within ISD, we've done quite a bit of work working with governments on initiating and setting up their NAP processes, getting them, kind of supporting them to get them off the ground. A number of countries have started to submit their actual NAP plans, the kind of document, and it's more than a document. This is a process, but it does typically have a document. They've started to submit these plans to the UNFCCC, and we're seeing that quite a few of them are thinking about conflict and peace building within these plans. So 38 plans have been submitted thus far. Of those, 25 of them talk about conflict in some way or talk about peace building in some way, whereas 13 of them don't. And this isn't just conflict-affected states. This is, countries like St. Lucia, Brazil, Chile. They're also talking about the potential conflict as a source of climate vulnerability, and then identifying climate change as a potential driver of conflict, particularly around water and land. But many of them see adaptation as a means of preventing conflict and building peace. So that's why conflict considerations are being brought up within these national adaptation plan documents. It's because countries recognize that there is something potentially there when it comes to adaptation, addressing these issues. So, Burkina Faso, for example, in their NAP document, talk about establishing an institute for monitoring pastoral conflicts around water and land with sedentary farmers. Again, as a way of trying to prevent and avoid some of those and serve as maybe an early warning system to some of those conflicts emerging. Timor-Leste, as they talk through their peace building plan, they very much put community engagement at the center of that, and they see the NAP and the integration of climate change adaptation considerations as a core piece of their nation building and their recovery process. There's quite a few kind of good examples of countries doing this, whether it's DRC, South Sudan. They're speaking in good terms about how they can use climate change as a potential climate change adaptation as a potential means of supporting their peace building plans. So very promising on that front. There is, of course, much that needs to be done in order to make this happen within governments. We've identified a few areas, and I touch upon these in my chapter of the report. Leadership will be crucial, kind of ensuring that at the political level, high-level political leaders and champions are demonstrating a sustained commitment to aligning adaptation and peace building. This can be part of rebuilding the social contract as well that they have with their citizens. So if in a fragile context, the government is seen as establishing a clear and realistic plan for reducing vulnerability to climate change and addressing some of the key risks to climate change, and then delivering upon that, that can be a key way of rebuilding their social contract with their citizens. Whereas if they're seen as not doing that whatsoever and not doing anything about the increasing and accelerating impacts of climate change that are affecting the lives of their population, there's that contract between, again, the populace and the government can be further frayed. A second one is information sharing. In many fragile states, there's just not a lot of information when it comes to climate risks. I took a look at some of the weather stations, for example. Key example, in many fragile states, weather stations have been destroyed. The staff that can maintain them and understand them and use them have either fled or they've been affected by the violence in some other way. And without that core data and information about climate change, it's very difficult to write good policy and write good plans and know what you're adapting to. So a lot of support needs to come within governments and from outside into rebuilding some of the capacity to generate this kind of information on climate change. How is it going to affect us? How is it going to affect livelihoods, and what are our adaptation options? And if you look at weather stations, just to take an example, Afghanistan, for example, has 4 weather stations. Whereas if you look at Finland, the world's least fragile state, they have 922 weather stations. So there's just not a lot of capacity for generating that kind of information. That's something that needs to change. A third area that requires a lot more is financing, of course. So financing both from the domestic side, if it's available, domestic budgets are going to be quite constrained within fragile states, but international financing for climate change in these kinds of contexts is woefully lacking at the moment, and needs to increase significantly. UNDP did a study earlier this year on the amount of climate financing that's flowing to fragile states, and they found that for a non-fragile state on a per capita income, climate financing for both mitigation and adaptation is about $161 per year, whereas for fragile states, it's $10 per year. And for extremely fragile states, it's $2 per year. So there's a massive, massive imbalance in the amount of funding that's going into these contexts. And it's understandable to a degree from a donor perspective. It's very risky to invest in these kinds of contexts, but clearly, if non-fragile states, including small island developing states, are getting $161 per capita per year, and extremely fragile states are just getting $2 per year, there's something wrong there. Very briefly, because I noticed that we're running short on time, institutional arrangements are going to be crucial here, and making sure that there's coordination between the people who are running peace building programming and the people who are responding to climate change and responding to adapting to climate change. Stakeholder engagement will be important and very different in conflict affected states as well. I think in most countries, they're not going to be talking to a humanitarian community, for example, on how climate adaptation needs to be integrated into humanitarian response. And then finally, capacity building is going to be crucial as well. Capacity building at the individual level for staff members, for stakeholders, and at the institutional level as well. And making sure that both of these know how to make adaptation programming conflict sensitive, but also know how to make peace building programming more climate resilient. So I think I'm probably past time at this point, but I'll leave it there and welcome any questions. But thanks very much for the opportunity to offer a few interventions.
Thanks, Alec. That was actually really insightful, and I think as you said, you know, there is an opportunity, there are potential. So your contribution was actually quite positive, but also at the same time you highlighted so many challenges, right? And so challenging challenges, including, you know, building information collecting capacity, and also the financing, which I think is really a key issue. I guess I will start the round of question from you, Alex, just to reverse it a bit the order. I have a question more in general on those, in terms of what is your perspective in terms of those challenges, and what are the I would say easier to tackle. And the other question related to that is there an example you can share with us of an app or some other type of way in which countries in fragile countries have really have started really making a difference in terms of aligning to agendas?
Sure. Yeah, no, I think that there is progress happening. There are some areas that are easier than others to address. I would say, you know, the capacity building side, on the information side, making those kinds of investments are areas that might be, none of this is easy, but might be you know, quicker to happen than solving the financing problem, for example, and really ramping up that financing. There is, with the NAP process, I think a lot of political momentum behind it, which is really promising. There is financing potential behind it as well. So as an example, every country in the world is allocated $3 million from the Green Climate Fund to develop their NAP. It's called their NAP readiness funding. So every country gets that money to develop their NAP. To take an example of a country that is using that in an interesting way, Somalia, as they applied for their NAP readiness funding from the Green Climate Fund, they very much integrated climate considerations into their proposal. They recognized in that proposal that the NAP was going to be crucial to addressing climate-related conflicts within that country. They have developed what's called a NAP framework to kind of lay out their vision and guiding principles and approach to the NAP process, which very much takes conflict sensitivity as a kind of core principle to the NAP and the way that they're going to approach it. That's one example of many, but I'd mentioned South Sudan is quite good. If you look at their NAP document when it comes to integrating conflict considerations. On the flip side of it, you can also look at peace building plans and see how they're starting to integrate climate considerations. And to take one example, the Central African Republic has in their peace building plan as a central pillar investments in climate resilience to increase the social contract between the government and the population. So for the government to show that they are actively kind of planning and investing and delivering on resilience, increased resilience, is a way that they see kind of rebuilding that trust that may be frayed with their population. A core challenge, and Erica also alluded to this in her comments, is those countries that don't have complete control of their territory. And how do you adapt to climate change when you don't have full control? Is there a way to reach those non-state actors and get them invested in climate change as well? If you're, Mali, for example, in the north of the country, you don't have complete control of the territory. How do you ensure that at least some adaptive capacities are built or maintained in that part of the country? That's going to be a massive challenge. And that's where I think governments have to reach out to humanitarian organizations. They have to kind of be innovative and flexible in finding new ways of trying to do that, because those are arguably the people that are most vulnerable and most in need of that kind of support.
And that's a great point as well, which we discussed with Erica later on. Just a question from our audience, Alec, which is more about, which I remember you addressed in your chapter, which is what is the unique constructive roles that women can actually play in this debate, and in really building climate resilience into peace building?
I think they play a foundational role, to be honest with you. And I think that given the differentiated vulnerability between men, women, in all their diversity, that if you are not integrating those gender considerations into both peace building and adaptation, whatever you're coming up with is not going to work. It's not going to work for everyone. So there's a crucial need within both peace building planning and adaptation planning to bring those gender considerations into it, and not impose them, but also have, men and women both at the table, again, in all their diversity, speaking to their vulnerabilities and coming up with the solutions that best fit their needs. Because without doing that, again, there's not going to be a sustainability to those solutions if you're not bringing that thinking to the fore and kind of really using it as the foundation for all of this planning.
Thanks, Alex. We have lots of nice questions, but I guess in the interest of time, I'll just move to Erica. Erica, obviously, Alex has again alluded to the important role and the challenge represented by state-armed group in peace building, but also in general in protecting natural resources. But we were quite optimistic to see that there are changes being made and a number of organizations really already operating in the space. Do you want just to give a brief overview on those?
Yes, absolutely. So in our analysis, we've been exploring the solutions to protect scarce natural resources from non-state armed groups' misuse, let's say. And we've seen multiple initiatives by non-governmental organizations to engage with these groups and to build accountability, for example, in the areas that are under the influence of non-state armed groups where the state cannot reach the population, as Alec was saying. And among other solutions, a good strategy seemed to be finding a common ground between non-state armed groups' doctrines and the international legal principles. And this could be just a starting point for building the consensus on common rules. And there is an organization called Geneva Co, for example, which engages with non-state armed groups, asking them to sign deeds of commitment regarding several different aspects of international law, for example, international environmental protection, or also regarding food security. And then this organization also monitors the compliance to these deeds from non-state armed groups. And this has been useful in many cases, but of course, it is not just NGOs' job to engage on this issue. And I think that due to the pressure of climate change, as Alec was mentioning, and all related security risks, and the fact that there is a momentum now to address these problems, there's been also in the UN system quite an attention to address environmental repercussions of climate conflicts. And this is, of course, in spite of the problems related to the effectiveness of the UN Security Council and the vetoes regarding some resolutions. But in the UN system, there have been developments whatsoever, and an example of this is the 2019 UN International Law Commission's draft principles on the protection of the environment in relation to armed conflicts. But also there are many other initiatives in the field, and this brings hope that a more effectiveness international framework on this issue can develop. But we also argued that the states can play a part on this. And we've seen that very often in internal conflicts, there is a third-party intervention because these are internationalized, and there is involvement of third-party states. And we could also look into the possibility for these states to put additional pressure on non-state armed groups that have control of the territories, and that sometimes are proxies of these third-party countries in the conflicts. And so this additional pressure could be put also in the compliance with international law and the legal framework in general. And there's another element that we believe is quite important, which is the importance of foreseen, which could be areas of potential risk of resource weaponization. And this could be done by monitoring and developing early warning systems that can help decision makers to focus on specific areas and to take preventive actions. But of course, I wanted to just come back on the point of Alec about the role of government and the cooperation with non-state armed groups. That of course sometimes it is challenging because some of them are considered terrorist groups, and so questions remain regarding the actual ability and willingness of state, but also non-state armed groups to ensure compliance to rules. But I think that these are questions that need to be addressed in the context of conflict-affected areas, where the state is not the main actor, and so the protection of the degrading environment rely on non-state armed groups.
Thanks, Enrica. And definitely, you know, as we have seen and we have heard, non-state armed groups are part of the problem, but definitely needs to be part of the solution in fragile countries, especially in internal conflict. I'm just aware of the time kind of running out, but I wanted to move to Laura, because obviously she has covered so many interesting topics in her presentation. And one of the things that we have I'm seeing also in terms of question, it's really this issue of the incentives, right, to put on especially the global south in terms of energy transition. What are those incentives, Laura? Can you give us some more details on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's a very good question, because it's not an easy answer. I think that the incentivization process is something that will need to progress over the next years in a very, very serious manner. You see at the moment in the COP discussions that finance is a huge source of frustration, obviously, and even anger amongst developing countries, because they don't feel that, well, if you want to split the world into two camps, which is a bit, you know, simplistic, but if you want to split it into the, you know, to the north or the west and the south, you see that, you know, there is this feeling that, you know, the majority of the countries that are actually contributing most to the mitigation or to the mitigation problem are those countries that have actually the funds to tackle them, and the ones that are hit the hardest are actually contributing the least. So I would say that in order to you know, seriously incentivize the global south into, you know, really kind of moving forward on the energy transition, you have to really put the money where your mouth is, right? In terms of that financing piece, I mean, I believe it was over 100 billion that was promised annually, and none of that has fully taken shape. So this will be a key issue in Egypt in November to ensure that trust and that, you know, seriousness of intent will be materialized. But more broadly speaking, if you look at geopolitical developments, I think it's going to be interesting to see how a number of countries can counter some of this dominant behavior of China. And China, of course, is extremely, well, and has been extremely clever in its Belt and Road Initiative in terms of creating very intricate connections with a slew of countries. So many countries are signed up to this initiative, which is basically a very intricate infrastructure sort of project across all kinds of lines. It's across energy, across cyber, across all kinds of ways. And what is interesting is that there is now an alternative development there taking place. So the US and the G7 have now really committed themselves to this so-called Build Back Better project, Build Back Better Road. This was launched in June in 21. And well, in terms of that infrastructure initiative, which is really going to be, well, it's aimed to be an alternative to the Chinese Belt and Road, there will be a massive opportunity to integrate the energy transition in terms of how you manage these infrastructure projects. And I would argue that that is kind of the key point here. If you want to incentivize this global south, don't just talk about mitigation, talk about sustainability, talk about how do you organize your economy in a way that's more resilient, that's stronger, that will prepare it for the next 100 years in a way that will will lead to more growth. And I think there is I mean, the question I think in the chat was, okay, how can this be at low cost already done? There are already a lot of schemes that the private sector is looking at as well in these countries, where you're just looking at simple ways of making an impact. So for example, how do you start cooking in a cleaner, more sustainable way? If you think about some of those numbers, I think it's about 2.5 billion people around the world that are not actually cooking on clean sort of materials. So they're still using coal or other very dirty fossil fuels. So these are the kinds of things. So a combination of big power incentivizing measures, plus the private sector really amping up its work in these countries. It is starting, but it needs to be ramped up really quickly. And only then, I think, will we have an answer that may be worthy for a lot of these countries to back on.
Thanks, Laura. And I have a question more from my Latin American kind of hat. What do you think about this proposal of Colombian President Petro well, he's not the first to propose it, but over that swap to actually in a way pay back the adaptation and mitigation efforts of developing countries. Does this proposal have any life, you think?
I need to unmute myself. So in terms, are you referring specifically to the statement that we need to look at loss and damages, or is it, you mean really more broadly in terms of the actual overall costs? That
like swapping that the global south has with money obviously for the global south to adapt to adopt policies of mitigations.
Yes, well, I think in terms of compensation, right? In terms of compensation, that will be a key topic that will be discussed at the COP27. In fact, it's very interesting because when it comes to looking at the question of justice, around this topic of financing and who has the responsibility to pay. I believe there's going to be a lot more ambition put in that discussion and a lot more serious words put into that. So I think the Colombian call for this is timely in the sense that there is more recognition, even though in the past it's been an absolute no-go for many countries to even put it on the table. Egypt is the host. Egypt has, as a representative of the African continent, a major stake in making sure that the most vulnerable are represented, not just in a fair way, but in a very decisive way at this COP. So I mean, I wouldn't be naive about the fact that all of a sudden things will be completely in terms of the financing, in terms of the burden, fully embraced by a lot of these top emitters. But I do think that there is now an opening for a discussion about how this can be arranged. And the examples that I gave earlier, I think provide a very interesting, perhaps, also in terms of promise for the future avenue. It's not talking about just compensating in terms of aid. It's really looking at how do we develop trade relationships? How do we develop an alternative that is interesting, can provide jobs, can provide more economic kind of incentives in the future. And ultimately, there will be more block formations. So I think it will be extremely important to see what the West or what some countries can offer that, makes the situation more attractive for many of these countries. And if you look at the current conditions under which many of these countries work under Belt and Road, so there's sometimes grueling investment conditions that they have to comply with, then I do think there's hope that there can be a better alternative for some of these countries.
Great, and I think that's a fantastic way to put to close our panel with some kind of positive going forward. And obviously, of course, we are heading into the COP27, so I think that's we all hope, as you say, that could be actually maybe a more promising COP in terms of implementation than the previous one, notwithstanding geopolitical tension, another bigger issue. With that, I will thank my panelists, Laura, Alec, and Erica. I will always thank once again the Adelphi for allowing us to host this session. And I will remind you once again that our report, the Armed Conflict Survey 2022, will be released on the 18th of November in Manama, and we are holding an event there, which is going to be virtual as well. So we hope to see you all there. Thanks so much, and well, let's see what the COP27 will bring this year. And see you soon. Thanks so much, and have a good rest of the digital segment. Bye bye.